Amanda told you, I'm at Portland State. I teach in the conflict resolution program there. And for the past 6 or 7 years, I've been directing the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Project. My specialty is in violence prevention and peace education. And about 8 years ago, I started to get more and more involved in Holocaust and genocide studies and atrocity prevention. I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and my first career was working with political asylees and refugees in the United States. And so I had a lot of practical experience and personal inquiry around Holocaust and genocide studies, but I've been cultivating that as an academic interest through speakers and fellowships and opportunities of learning over the past probably 8 years. Well, really, probably more like 15 years. And have been doing this project, directing this project for about the past 7 or 8 years. The exciting news that Amanda is alluding to is that we've been looking for a way to move our project beyond just a speaker series and try and institutionalize it within Portland State. And so we are launching our new Holocaust and Genocide/Atrocity Prevention program starting this fall. It's a graduate certificate that we are hosting in partnership with the School of Gender, Race, and Nations. And it's just a handful of classes, but it gives students an opportunity to really dig deeply into the shared history of atrocity that the international world shares with the United States in terms of looking at atrocities around identity and seeing how those how those develop over time, recognizing the the indicators that give us access to prevention, and coming up with some real creative ways to take that into our world. So there's a synthesis course at the end that invites students to make it relevant to whatever it is they're doing. If they're interested in developing policy, then it's a chance to write a white paper and do some policy around it. If people are interested in education, they can develop curriculum. If people are interested in activism and advocacy, there's opportunities to integrate what they've learned into something that's constructive in that direction. So it's a really exciting new certificate program that we're just in the process of marketing and letting folks know about. So if you're interested, my contact information is on the PowerPoint, and I encourage you to give me a jingle and we can talk about it. I'm really excited about it. And one of the things that Amanda again was alluding to is this notion of peace building, which oftentimes when we think about it, we have pretty distant ideas of what peace is. It's something that we go abroad to do, to places that are struggling. And one of the things that this year has really driven home for us is that the United States is not exempt from the kinds of risk factors that exist throughout the world. And so I mean, that's always been true, but it's never been more true, I think, than this past year of recognizing that. And so there's been a huge shift in the peace building community to really claim the domestic issues that are here and to recognize that atrocity prevention isn't just stopping genocide, it's stopping the precursors to genocide, which are things that I'm sure you're all familiar with, the Anti-Defamation League's Pyramid of Hate, and seeing that, you know, the very basic kinds of discriminatory belief structures that underlie identity-based conflict are very much at the foundation of the kinds of building blocks that lead us towards the atrocities of genocide. So peace building is not just, again, something that we do elsewhere. It's not something that it's not something that is unrelated to atrocity prevention. It's very much related in terms of creating change that keeps us from the kinds of harms that we see unfolding. So that's just a little bit of an introduction to who I am and what I'm doing and what I'm interested in. Does anyone have any questions before we jump into the presentation? Oh, Sherry's having a hard time hearing me. Can other people hear me? We're doing okay? Okay, great. When I'm sharing my screen, it's really hard to see the chat. So if I'm missing something, give me like a hand wave or something so I know to look there. Yeah, you guys all know that too, right? It's just a whole new world in the Zoom land.
I'll also watch the chat and
Okay.
interrupt you too
Okay.
if
Thank
somebody says
you.
something really
Oh,
good.
totally. I know. Well, I get lost in my own sort of process, and then suddenly I see there's a whole chat that I've missed. So if I'm not sharing my screen, I'm on top of it, but I'm going to share my screen to keep me on task. And also, I want to ensure that you have access to this presentation and the materials that I'm sharing with you because I put it together with the hope that it would be valuable to you, not just in learning today, but in as a resource to you in the future. So Amanda told you a little bit about the overview of the session. This was kind of us putting our heads together, going, what would be relevant? How do we tie this all together? And so, again, thinking about peace building in a broader sense and thinking about it very explicitly as something that makes a qualitative and quantitative difference in the way that we interact. We were thinking about it as a important sort of catchment for a variety of tools and transformations that can exist within learning communities. And so we're talking today about changing the quality of interaction, whether we're talking about it at the interpersonal level, the organizational level, or the global level, and specifically focusing on how some of these tools and tips that we can talk about under the peace building umbrella can be really instrumental in helping you shift the learning communities that you're engaged in, putting some of these skills into practice, but also using these skills and sensibilities to really shift the way that you think about the culture of your learning community. And specifically mobilizing learning community, because again, if we've learned anything over this past year, it's that for democracy to flourish, we need people to be activated. We need people to stand up for what they believe, regardless of what it is. It doesn't have to be that everyone has to sing the same song, but we need everyone paying attention in the way that puts legs underneath them, so that democracy can flourish. If at any point you want to stop me and ask questions, please do. There will be participative moments of this, but I'm going to just kind of jump into a little bit of a background to give us some shared language to think about when we're talking about these terms, and then we can talk more interactively about application of these ideas. So one of the key ways of thinking about peace, and again, I still remember, like in the '80s, I was working at a gallery and I had some earrings that had peace signs on them, and some woman came up to me and she goes, "Oh my God, are you for peace? Because I'm for peace." Like this was some like rare connection that we had, and might mean that we'd be lifelong friends, which I was perfectly willing to be, but I just like scratched my head afterwards. I'm like, what does she think peace is? That it should be such a novelty that we both value it, because it's really truly a shared value. And but oftentimes we sort of fetishize it and think about it as something that was popular in the '60s, or that's utopian or idyllic, or something that is just for hippies. And I admit to being one, but that is not the exclusive domain of peace, right? And needless to say, there's a whole academic discipline that's grown up to support the ideas of peace and to concretize them in ways that are sufficiently nuanced so that we can like tuck into them with some meaning instead of just like, oh, peace, yeah, that's when everything's perfect forever and no one ever suffers. That doesn't give us a whole lot to work with. So, feminist scholars first, and Johan Galtung second, who is a Dutch theorist, came up with this way of talking about the difference between negative peace and positive peace. And I think this is a good framing for us to think about how we're going to take the ball and run with this notion of peace building. Negative peace is usually what we think about when we think about peace, and that's the absence of war or the absence of violence and the fear of violence that's associated with it. And that is certainly something that I think we could all probably agree upon as being worthy, but it doesn't really lend itself to building the kind of imagination for us to know what to do about it, right? In fact, it lends itself to sort of the conundrum of like, oh my God, why is there so much war and violence in the world? Darn it, what are we going to do? So talking about it within the terms of negative peace create this sort of idea that peace is utopian or idyllic or unattainable, or something that can only happen if humanity is destroyed, that the humanity that we currently have is destroyed because we're such warmongers. So in the field of peace studies, we talk a lot about positive peace as being something that gives us a little bit more traction on the ideas of peace. It's the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies, right? So it's not what's absent, it's what's present. And so we start thinking about what's present to create peace. We start to see, oh, actually, yeah, we don't have to look out for it on the distant horizon with doves and rainbows, right? We need to think about it as something that we can actually like get our hands dirty to try and create and co-create. And we're better to do that than within the institution of schools, right? That's where we have captive audiences. That's where we have people hopefully hungry for learning, right? And where we have the capacity to really influence people's beliefs and understandings about what's possible. So that is the frame of reference that we're going to be working with today, is this notion of positive peace and what we can do to create something that's durable and realistic and possible, and that lends itself to this idea of peace being something that is concrete, not nebulous. Does that make sense to folks? Great. So there's a lot of different ways that peace building is talked about, and there's a wonderful organization called the Alliance for Peacebuilding that's been involved in peace building efforts through the ages, but has really been on the forefront in this past year of recognizing this hand in glove relationship with peace building and the current sort of social and political moment within the United States that has so many let's call them opportunities for transformation, shall we? So, peace building really is positive peace in action. And the Alliance for Peace Building recognizes peace building as this elastic term that has all of these different applications and actors that are involved in peace building processes. But rather than limiting peace building to any one particular school of thought, and there are many within the field of peace building in terms of who does what, how. I love the broadness of this definition that says peace building is ultimately really anything that supports human security. And human security is another academic term that's worthy of knowing because it speaks to the reality where people have a freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom from humiliation, right? So it's not, the Grateful Dead hasn't even figured into our conversation yet, right? So you don't have to be a hippie to want that human security where people have the capacity to live outside of fear, outside of want, and outside of humiliation. Hang on one second. It looks like someone's trying to get into the room. Are you on the chat, Amanda? There's a couple.
Yeah, I'm on the chat. Ralph just put in a really good comment that I thought
Yeah.
was really interesting about negative peace and
Yes.
exporting violence to other communities. And when I'm thinking about the creation of ghettos in the United States, which is my area of research, that's something that really connected with me about white flight
Yes.
and purposely segregating and excluding communities so that peace is maintained, and I'll put peace in quotations, and then it's relegated elsewhere. Right. So I don't know, that was just a really good thought that just put all these connections in my head.
Yeah, peace is one of those horrible words that has been co-opted to mean all sorts of things, right? And like mostly like in the example you give, it's like the not in my backyard peace, right? Like I want my community to be safe for everyone in my community, but I don't care about the them that I'm gonna, you know, push into the margins even further.
Yeah.
Great. Hey, Amanda, can you encourage those who don't have their sound off to
Oh,
turn their sound off, or maybe even just pop it?
I'll mute everybody.
That's super. Thank you. So, Lisa Schursch is one of the scholars that I use a lot to talk about peace building. She does beautiful work. I believe she's at Eastern Mennonite University. And this is a definition that she has offered, which says peace building efforts aim to manage, mitigate, resolve, and transform central aspects of conflict through official diplomacy, civil society peace processes, and informal dialogues, negotiations, and mediations. She says that peace building addresses the root causes of violence and fosters reconciliation to prevent the return of instability and violence. Peace building efforts seek to change beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, and to transform dynamics between individuals and groups toward a more stable, peaceful coexistence. Peace building also helps create structures and institutions that provide platforms for the nonviolent resolution of conflict and stabilize fractured societies, right? So it's a beautiful and robust definition of what peace building does. Again, lending itself to our imagination to think about peace with legs underneath it instead of thinking about it as something that exists in some potential on a rainbow out in space with Grateful Dead music playing. And so she offers this wonderful graphic about peace building as being sort of in this nexus of all of these different aspects of society, looking at everything from youth to women to security, science and technology, rule of law, religion, um, refugee and internally displaced people, nuclear proliferation, humanitarian aid, human security, human rights, health, genocide prevention, food security, environment, development, democracy and governance, conflict resolution and transformation, conflict prevention, and academic. So these are just to sort of indicate that peace is not something that has to exist exclusively within any one domain. You don't have to be a political scientist to be an advocate for peace. There's ways to bring this kind of management, mitigation, resolution, and transformation of conflict into whatever sphere of influence that we're working in. And again, I don't need to tell you that schools make a big difference, or classrooms, even a singular learning community within a larger learning community, is a great example of how and where we have the potential to work to create peace.
Amanda, I'm wondering, as I'm sitting here looking at all of these like framings of peace building and just thinking about our students in the classroom and how misleading the term peace building can be. And again, I keep coming back to like this word peace is not like it's all rainbows and like things like that. But when you get down to it, you're like, it's not that at all. And how so many of our students will probably think that peace building and peace is people being calm, measured, you know, using nice voices. Right. But peace building is hard and there's disagreement involved in it. There's like this work involved in it, kind of like what you said, by like getting your hands dirty. And so I'm just like wondering if maybe later on we can speak and have the teachers just like really think about how they can work with their students to help them reframe what peace building is envisioned in their students' heads. Totally. As like just sitting down and being really calm with each other when that's not necessarily how peace building unfolds. Yes, you have the goal of coming together, but that process can be really messy sometimes.
Right. So Supreme Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "For the simplicity on this side of complexity, I wouldn't give you a fig. But for the simplicity on the other side of complexity, I would give you everything I own." And that, to me, that addresses this notion of peace. Like, we can't just pretend that we're all calm and call it peace. But if we get through a difficult process and end up in a place of calm, then that is worth its weight in gold. Do you know what I mean? Do you see the difference between those two? So if we talk about peace as something because we just want to enforce it, we miss out on the richness of getting through that sort of metamorphosis of conflict, or addressing what it is that created the conflict in some way that truly dismantles it, so that we end up in a place where there's something much richer than, you know, it may look the same on the outside, but it feels entirely different on the inside. And I think Lisa Schersch's definition here does a beautiful job of really articulating what those root changes can look like. But Amanda, we are going to definitely get to that. And if for some reason we miss it, there's time at the end where we can be more concrete about what that can look like. I also, some of you may be familiar with the work of John Paul Lederach, who's from Notre Dame. and he wrote a beautiful book about conflict transformation called the Moral Imagination, which is one of my favorite books, and I'm just using it in a course that I'm planning for this summer. So I've just been enjoying it again. But it shows kind of the disciplinary wheel. He works in higher education, and this is something that even in conflict resolution, we're branded as conflict resolution, but really we're peace builders. And this graphic, I think, does a beautiful job of sort of, again, giving us more imagination about what's involved in peace building. And the inner circle speaks to the sort of three areas that are part of peace building: the violence prevention and conflict response and transformation, which again is my expertise as well as our program's expertise. But we also have expertise and wisdom in justice and healing, looking at how conflict resolution processes have moved into the realm of justice, and things like restorative justice have evolved as ways to put legs underneath the ideas of peace in very concrete ways. And then structural and institutional change and development. And then if we look on the outer wheel, it shows how those play out in society, again, making it a far more concrete undertaking. So things like dialogue, strategies for change, government and multilateral efforts like track 3 diplomacy and that sort of thing, humanitarian action, trauma healing, transitional justice, restorative justice, advocacy and solidarity and law, dealing with transnational and global threats, development, education, all of those things, just not dissimilar from the previous graphic, speak to how broadly peace building can be applied, and can be used as sort of a touchstone in all of these different disciplinary undertakings. And so I just wanted to share that with you again to contextualize it and to make it a little bit more alive than this nebulous sense of something unattainable. So this might be a chance to answer some of Amanda's question right now, because she and I have a remarkable way of putting our ideas together even when we're not communicating. But thinking about your role in schools or in classrooms or in learning communities or in community, and maybe it's not even within your role as a teacher, what are the ways and the places that you're already engaged in peace building work? So this is a chance for you to actually contribute to the conversation, instead of just looking gorgeous in your squares. Just chime in. I can't see everyone. I don't think. Maybe I can shift this a little bit so I can see most of you. Um, yeah, I can. So you can either jump in or raise a hand or whatever you'd like to do. So with this orientation to peace building and to something a little bit more concrete than perhaps you were thinking about it previously, what are the ways in which you're already a peace builder?
I think the first answer that comes up for me is just thinking about like content and curriculum and teaching all about conflict and different approaches to resolution,
Yeah,
which is
totally.
of course negative peace, but still.
Nonetheless, yeah, I mean, it's still working on peace building. It's creating the opportunity for students to interact with the ideas of conflict, the ideas of resolution, the possibilities that exist, and scaffolding them into recognizing conflict as resolvable, which is not something that, our news media and many of our families have the capacity to do. So, including mine, so just saying. That's a great answer. What are some other ways that you're already being a peace builder?
Uh, for me, it's a kind of about, like you talked about, getting past that complexity, right?
Yeah.
For me as a teacher, and probably just as a person, often a lot of people who are in my circle are pretty privileged and pretty safe, and they feel like they're living in somewhat of a negative peace, right?
Hmm.
So it's really about revealing those contradictions and showing those complexities. Like when I drive down I-5 and I get passed by people in BMWs and Mercedes while we're driving by tents where people are living because they can no longer afford to live in the city, right? The violence we do to our poor here is real. The violence our black people face in the streets is, a constant ongoing thing. But so many people live in negative peace right here in our town. So
Yeah.
it's mostly about that, like revealing the real complexity in our and opening up to people that we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Ralph. You know, sort of pulling back the curtain on the normalcy of what's around us and bringing awareness of discrepancy and structural violence is what we would call that, of inequity, and drawing that into the conversation instead of just saying, ah, look at the disparities. How do you bring that into the conversation to help students understand how that fits into the social problems that we're looking at? Yeah, great. Other thoughts? These are great. These are far more complicated than the ones I was thinking of. So I love it.
We're in higher ed, so we're in the College of Education. I am a graduate advisor and teach a couple of lower level teacher prep courses, and then Tanya teaches in our ESOL program, and in our actually across multiple undergrad and graduate programs. So I know that we have worked a lot on like identity development to help to see how our own identities can cause trauma and at times for our students or our colleagues. And then also, yeah, I really agree with what Ralph said, bringing awareness of negative peace versus, like exploring further what our students, what they've experienced, but also maybe what they haven't experienced. And so that they're just truly not aware of. And so bringing to light others' experiences based on their identities.
Yeah. And Kristen, what you said reminded me very much of what Ralph said in the sense that you're encouraging sort of a reflexivity as an important skill to be able to situate oneself in a larger context, right? You know, I grew up in a very affluent suburb and I thought I was poor when I grew up because I didn't live in a big house. I lived in what was a small house, but it turned out it was in Palo Alto, and that small house, could feed, several nations for eternity, so we have very little understanding of where we sit contextually or how other people are either accessing or not accessing the same privileges and benefits that we have by virtue of our location. And so helping people sort of expand their understanding of who they are, how they sit, and where that puts them in this larger context of inequity, really. I mean, that's one of the big themes in the United States right now in this social moment, is just a recognition of how differently we experience the same system.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
I have a situation that happened in my class recently that reminds me of this structure that you're talking about. And I don't know if it would be appropriate to share it.
I think so. I mean, wait,
Yeah,
you're muted,
it's
Amanda.
brief.
What
Yeah,
were you
it's
saying,
brief.
Amanda?
I was going to say, I can always like take that part out of the recording so it doesn't get blasted into the world.
Yeah, it's brief and I don't have to talk about any specifics of it, but on the first day that we were back teaching, we were talking about immigration, and in the classroom, the conversation got heated and a student walked out of the class, and it was the very first day of being back in school, and I thought, oh my gosh, and I've been teaching these students online for half a year. Do I not know them? What's going on? And so I reflected on this and I thought to myself, oh, we need to go back over discussion agreements and how we respect one another and how we share information that might be judged as difficult for people to hear. And going through that process was hard. And students had to sort of own what had happened the day before. We all had to own what happened the day before. Some questions were asked about me and my responsibility, and we got through it. And now we are much closer as a class, and we're much more real with each other. And I hope that the next time we have a conflict, we can fall back on what we agreed to, and it will get us through.
That's a wonderful story, Katrina. Thank you for sharing that. And I think about the fact that that process gave you not necessarily a protection in terms of sort of ground rules or communication guidelines. It gave you a process that you can return to and reevaluate, you know?
Right.
So everyone has a shared investment in the agreements so that
Mhm.
if something were to come up again, which invariably something will come up again, whether it's now or later, they can say,
Right.
you can always just say, hey, let's go back and look at these agreements. Do these still work for people?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then just put it back into their own agency to be able to say, oh, right, we agreed that we didn't want to put people down. And I noticed that someone was just put down, or that we want to create a safe place for divergent opinions or different ideas. And so then, they get to be the ones who notice notice those breaches of trust and also fix them,
Right.
remedy
Right.
them.
And we discussed the process for fixing, like if it was
Right.
egregious or small, like how do we restore this community so that one who has transgressed the community feels welcomed and not shamed, and the people who have been transgressed upon can say, okay, yeah, you can come back.
Beautiful. That's just
And
beautiful. Yeah.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I
I
mean, I
felt
think
better out through it.
I think that and we'll talk about this in just a minute, but one of the key parts of peace building is recognizing that we blow it. That's
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that everything has to get flushed down the toilet. That just means that it's an opportunity to reassess. And sometimes we think, sometimes we get into a paradigm of thinking that if we're not perfect all the time, we've lost the opportunity to really commit to this. And in fact, it's the opposite. Just like Kristen's example, like when we have something hard to get through, I think it was Kristen, maybe it was Ralph, I forgot now. When we have something difficult that we get through, getting through it actually strengthens our understanding of what we want and what we need and how to get it. Great, thank you. So I'm sure that there's others you can, there's stuff in the chat here. Great. So some ideas that I came up with on ways that you are probably already doing this in different ways within your learning communities, again, whether you're in K through 12 or higher ed, is advocating for for justice. When you see injustice in your classroom, or in your learning community or in your larger community, how do you become an advocate for that? How are you an ally for student needs? How do you bring those to the surface and try and match resources with the needs that you encounter? How are you an activist for social change? And Katrina's story was a great story of being an activist through um, carving out the space for conversation and understanding to happen. Being a champion for cultural shift, recognizing when there's a challenge that's happening and that needs to, like, for example, in the Black Lives Matter uprising, that's something to talk about, that's something to address, and that's something to use so that we can shift the way that classrooms and learning communities and communities as a whole are engaging. Support for environmental justice in different ways, validation of student voices, supporting critical thinking so that, like Rolf was saying, like how do you get people to see what is happening in the world? Um, and facilitator of student agency. How do you relocate the power and agency of action into the student's purview so that you're not just fixing things yourself, but you're creating opportunities for students to step in and do their own fixing? All of those things are ways in which most educators, are well trained in how to do these things. These are just, good pedagogical practice. But we don't necessarily recognize those actions as peace building actions. And I hope that you will begin to recognize those as peace building actions because they're so important and they are really the building blocks for students to feel like they have the capacity to create change in their own lives beyond, school, but like their whole lives, right? So, so the next question, and I'll have a slide with some answers here, so don't feel like you have to be come up with all of the answers, and this is just a starting point for this conversation as well. But like, what are the ways that you can use peace building to address and redress conflict? That was a great title that Amanda came up with, and I just jumped on board with it. But it's a great one to think about. Again, thinking about peace building as something that helps us to respond to conflict in constructive ways, ways that maximize the benefit of peace building efforts, right? When we shut things down or we solve them for people, oftentimes, or we don't support people in their experiences of conflict. Those are the things that create destructive outcomes. So if we think about peace building as this commitment to human security, then how do we leverage that to address and redress conflict? What are the things that you are currently doing? I know in the chat you had a little conversation about who's doing what with restorative justice, and that's a bit of a hit or miss phenomenon within particular learning communities. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So don't feel like you have to address it all in this venue.
I'll share. I teach a lot of diversity courses as well at Eastern Oregon University, and I direct our teacher pathway program for pre-service teachers in high school. And so a lot of what we've been looking more deeply into is cultural humility. And so how can we continue this growth, but it comes from within us, and understand that it's a journey and that we intersect in many different ways. And to me, that's been really empowering for students, because they're reflecting, and sometimes they do get a little upset because they're reflecting, but it's not somebody in power shutting down their reflections or who they are or their experiences, and not acknowledging and celebrating their experiences and perspectives, but their own internal reflective practice upon which they start to see things from other perspectives through discussion and again, this cultural humility
That's great.
stance. Yeah.
Thank you, Tawny. And one of the things about cultural humility that I love, and it's a topic that I teach a lot of in my intercultural conflict resolution classes, but really it's more important than that. I mean, it's a great model to continue to use in any context. One great way to think about cultural humility is this thing called COVID-19, because I don't know if you've noticed, but people have a lot of opinions about what the right way to deal with COVID is. Like, what's the right amount of isolation? What's the appropriate bubble? What's the right amount of mask wearing? Whether or not to get a vaccine, what you can do or not do once you get the vaccine, when it's appropriate to open things up. You know, this is ad nauseum a topic of conversation in all of our circles and families and communities and schools and everything else. And if there's one thing that I have learned and been able to share with all of my willing subjects is that everyone is going to do COVID the way they feel comfortable doing COVID. Right? There's no benefit that's going to come out of shaming or strong arming people. I mean, we have opinions, we do, but that doesn't mean that our opinions are going to make the other person feel like they shouldn't go to the grocery store, that they should wipe down everything. You know, like, everyone has their own way of doing it. And there's a certain, obviously, poignance because of the moment that we're in to talk about COVID in the context of cultural humility. But there's also a little bit liberates us from the volatility of putting it into identity terms, because that can be particularly, you know, in Eastern Oregon or wherever you are in a community that may not have the visual diversity that that we might think about in cultural humility terms. Talking about everyone's individual orientation to navigating COVID is a great way to talk about cultural humility and to think about peace building and to think about how we are charitable to people who do things differently than we do. You know, what a wonderful invitation into expanding our capacity to meet people where they are, which is really what cultural humility is about. Amanda, you took your mute off, so you have something to say.
I did, and I don't know if it is going to add anything to the conversation, but it was just a thought when you were talking about conflict res and thinking about what is the difference or overlapping between conflict res and peace building? Like, is conflict resolution part of peace building? Is it something wholly separate? And that was just like a thought that was going through my mind of when we're talking about shared language and how conflict res is such a part of schools. Mm-hmm. Or at least it was when I was teaching, and even as a student, as like peer leaders who helped students sit down with other students to address conflict. But I'm just thinking about those two terms, and are they interchangeable? Are they not? Are they overlapping?
Well, I just take you back to Letter X Wheel, because that's why I think this is valuable, is it situates conflict resolution as one of the core elements of peace building. Right? It's one of the core elements of peace building. And, you know, again, there's branding about why we're conflict resolution versus conflict transformation versus conflict management versus peace and justice studies versus peace building. But Letteract just says, you know what, guys, you're all freaking peace builders. So like, let's stop splitting hairs and trying to figure out which discipline, you know, we're part of. This is all peace building effort. And a lot of these have more skill-based elements that, you know, like violence prevention and conflict response and transformation, that is a sort of skill-based set. Justice and healing is more of a strategic shift, right? There's all of these different ways and things that move within the umbrella of peace building. And conflict resolution, I think, are the skills that put it into practice in terms of our interactions.
So then I have two other like follow-up questions / thoughts, because I think this wheel is really helpful to understand. And even when we're talking with our colleagues and students about how peace building is like multifaceted and how there isn't just one way to do it. So depending on the situation that you're in, the people that you're around, the whatever XYZ other factors are, there are more than one ways that peace building can look and can unfold. And some of it depends on who we are as people and what I feel comfortable with. So I think about this a lot in terms of like resistance during the Holocaust, which is like, Shane can talk about, like I've been into his class to do this thing and we talk about all of the different ways that people resisted. So that was just one thought. And then my last one actually was a question. I don't know if it's appropriate here or later on, but I'm just going to throw it out there. But Shane, when you were talking about peace building and looking at the conflicts that you address in the curriculum that you teach, it made me think about how can we better teach peace building with the curriculum and the content examples to examine how peace building happened or how it didn't, how maybe it could have, how would it have worked differently?
Well, Shane, you can totally answer that, but like, what I'd love to do is bring that back at the end, because I think we might address it through the concrete sort of framing that I'm going to offer you for that will show us what it does look like, and then we can note its absence. Yeah?
Yeah, that's fine.
But Shane, jump in if you want to answer her question. He's like, I'm sunbathing. It's good. So the three things that I came up with, that are very much a part of my teaching practice, in terms of how we can address and redress conflict through peace building, are these three very concrete concepts that I think speak directly to Amanda's question, but if not, we can revisit it again. She's just like, she's like my perfect person to ask the question that leads me into the segue of exactly what I was going to say here. And that is that the three really basic skills, again, very endemic to education anyway, and very much a part of the pedagogy that a good teacher and a student-centered teacher will offer, is a focus on the cultivation of curiosity, the encouragement of empathy, and the mobilization of action. And so these are the three concrete steps that I want to focus on in the remainder of our time together, to put some life into them and also give you some concrete ways of thinking about how to either measure the peace building that's happening in your classroom and or expand it through these various different nuanced ways that we can bring this to bear in our communities. So in all of my classes, anyone who's taken my classes hopefully can parrot this back, and I ask them to frequently. If there's one thing that you take away from a conflict resolution class, I hope that it's remembering to bring curiosity to conflict, because it's the antithesis of the destructive cycle of conflict, which is, brings up all sorts of other emotions. Usually it brings up like, well, I know exactly what that person's thinking or doing, or why they're a jerk, or why this is a stupid thing, or why that's a bad opinion, or why they should be wearing a mask, or why they're not doing COVID right, or why they're not, engaging in nonviolence correctly, or social change. Like, every time we have a judgment about what someone's doing, there's an absence of curiosity there. So when we bring curiosity to conflict, when we bring curiosity centrally to the process of peace building, like, I swear to God, more than half of our work is done. It's like the simplest answer. It's like the magic pill. I don't know if that's the blue pill or the red pill in the Matrix, but like, figure out your own metaphor. If there's one thing, it's curiosity. So I want to talk a little bit about curiosity. And that is that conflict is inevitable. The fact that conflict occurs, whether it's in your classroom interpersonally, or whether it's in society as a whole, whether it's internationally, whether it's genocide, doesn't matter. Conflict is inevitable, and conflict is normal, and it has the potential to be transformative. Oftentimes when conflict occurs, we respond like it's an aberration, like somehow it's proof of our failure, or something that has is evidence of our incapacity. And if we shift our focus to the fact that conflict is an inevitability, it gives us a huge amount of latitude to address it constructively. And when we bring our curiosity to it, not like, how could this happen? Clearly everything is wrong because this happened. Instead we say, wow, here's conflict. Why? Why do we have this conflict? It's like the simplest little shift in awareness that gives us a whole different perspective. I've been talking to my two teenagers about it all afternoon, frankly, because they have very little curiosity about so much about each other right now. They're 17 and 18 and just ready to launch and be done living together. I might also say that it was not a very effective conversation. I don't think I convinced either of them to be curious, but here we are. I'll talk to you instead, and I hope you'll take away more than they did. At least for another 10 years, probably they'll come back and go, Mom, you remember that time you talked about curiosity? Turns out that was right. Yes, it was. So bringing your curiosity to it invites you into the question of why. Not why are you such a jerk, but like, what's going on here? I want to know. So when conflict occurs, we don't just say that person's a jerk. We say, I wonder why this conflict is here, right? Conflict is inevitable. What is it here to teach us? It's normal. What opportunities are there here for us to learn from, or change from, or grow from in some way? And one of the ways that conflict theory supports this notion of why is it moves from the positions of what you want because of this, that either created the conflict. If we both want the same thing, or we want something that the other person is not capable of giving, we are in a direct conflict or a direct contest with the other person to try and get what we want from them. And that's often where we get to loggerheads and conflict. So the difference between positions of what you want and interests are the underlying reasons about why you want it. So again, we judge people. They're not wearing a mask. Their bubble's too big. They're doing this. This is not curious. These are positional stances that judge the other person for what they want or how they're doing it. If we move to a point of curiosity, why do you want it? That's interesting. Why do you want that? We open up the door to a whole different type of communication that invites a better understanding of the underlying reasons, and not surprisingly, invites us into a far more robust exploration of solutions. So there's a classic example of this. Any of you who've taken a conflict resolution class will be familiar with this, but oftentimes we use the example of the orange. There's a single orange that I was going to say Amanda and I both want, but that will be very confusing when we start to tease it apart. So maybe Shane and I want the same orange, right? And so what do you think we should do to try and solve the problem of who gets the orange? How would you solve that if two of your students or kids or friends wanted the same orange? What are some of the strategies you would use to solve that problem?
If you're a math teacher and you went to school to teach math, it would be that one person cuts the orange in half and then the other person gets to choose the first piece.
Exactly. So you would split it in some
Emily,
fashion.
yes. Emily said share split.
Right, yeah, share split, right? And in conflict terminology, that's called a compromise, where you say, you know what, you both want it, there's only one, so you each get half, right? And that is a beautiful and appropriate response if you have no curiosity, right? What do you want? You want the orange? There's one orange, two people, you split it. And you come up with ways to split it so that it's more fair than other ways, right? In conflict resolution, what do you think that we would do given what I just told you about positions and interests? What would it look like to bring curiosity to this conundrum? Someone other than Amanda?
Well, Shane put determine who needs the orange more.
You could determine who needs the orange more and turn it into a contest of need.
Or examine why there's only one orange.
Look at the supply chain and figure out if there's access to more.
Is there anything else one of the people want?
Is there something that would you prefer a pair? I have lots of pairs. So you could look at alternatives. But still, what would it look like to just be curious? What would you ask someone if you were truly curious about their need for an orange? There's a cheat sheet on the slide to the right.
Why do you want the orange?
Why do you want the orange? It's such a simple question, right? Why do you want the orange? We didn't ask that for several tries here. Why do you want the orange? Well, Shane, why do you want the orange?
Vitamin C deficiency.
Okay, so Shane has a vitamin C deficiency, and so he needs the meat of the orange or the juice of the orange to address his vitamin C deficiency. Oh, good. Ralph has an orange for all of us. Thank you. Why do I want the orange? I'm baking a cake and I need the zest for the frosting. So it could be when we bring our curiosity to why we want the orange, there may not be a contest. There may not even be a contest, let alone a conflict. We're so quick to just try and solve the problem before we even know what the problem is, right? So lending your curiosity, well, why do you want it? I swear to God, 9 times out of 10, I've been doing this for 30 years, 9 times out of 10, you're not in conflict over what it is that you want. You have very different needs, and you're fighting at cross purposes because you have never even brought the curiosity to find out why you want it in the first place. So it's deceptively simple, admittedly, but the orange example is a powerful one because really, truly, 9 times out of 10, we're not competing for the same thing. There is no limit in the resource. We just need to bring our curiosity to the situation to understand why we want what we want. And when we do that, we find infinite solutions that we never would have found if we didn't bring our curiosity to the process. So going through that process gives us what's called, expanded perspective. We're solving a different problem than we even thought we were solving before we lent our curiosity to it. Does that make sense to people? Now, this wasn't meant to shame any of the previous answers. Those were all really good answers, but there's a better answer, right? When we lend our curiosity to it. And one of the things that's interesting as a conflict resolver and someone who's taught for 25 years now is that people often think that they would make a good conflict resolver because they're really good at solving problems. And it turns out that's the last thing that you do as a conflict resolver is solve other people's problems. And I'd say like 99% of our students are there because they're really good at solving problems and they think that they could solve everyone else's problems. And it's just not the job of conflict resolution. The job of conflict resolution is to support people in solving their own problems by having new perspectives. My idea about splitting the orange, no matter how great that idea is, has nothing to do with the needs that are present in the parties. So it's a very deceptively simple but profoundly transformative reframing of how we address conflict.
So Ralph asked in the chat, what about conflicts where we don't understand why we hold our positions?
So sometimes it takes some scaffolding to try and figure out like why you want it. So maybe it's someone helping lend imagination to someone. Well, you know, and conflict processes, and again, this can look very differently in different contexts. Sometimes you spend time with a person kind of digging into the depths of what needs are going to be met by a particular standpoint or what the underlying goals are in that, right? Because if it turns out, for example, well, I'm hungry, well, there's a lot of other ways to satisfy hunger than having this orange. So let's explore those, right?
Before we move on, I'm looking at the first conflict is inevitable. And I'm sitting here a little bit uncomfortable with it in a good way, but I'm hoping you can help me like process through mass atrocities and not having our students think like, so the Holocaust was inevitable because conflict is? And
Right.
like, where do we, because I could see students going to that place of
Absolutely.
like, then interpreting like, oh, so like genocide is just a thing that's going to occur no matter what then.
So again, if we go back to the American defamation, I should have included the graphic in the slideshow, but because I think it's such a valuable graphic. If we think about conflict and identity-based conflict as being the foundational building blocks of mass atrocities, we can see that there's lots of conflict that happens that precede the kinds of severity of conflict that when we get to atrocity and genocide, right?
Okay.
Genocide is the tippity top of the triangle. But if we recognize that conflict is inevitable and normal and has the potential to be transformative, then what if we were to address those identity-based conflicts before they escalated into mass atrocities? Instead, typically what happens is we just ignore them. Like, right? Look at what happened with racism in the United States. So ignored until the past couple of years. The majority population of the United States had to pay attention because of the extremity of atrocity that was happening in the United States, right? Initially, it was sort of like, well, it's those people, it's not everyone. But at some point, there was no plausible deniability that this was an issue that required everyone's attention, right? But yeah, it could have been addressed a long time ago in a lot of different ways, you know, and continues to be addressed step by step through creative methodologies.
Okay, thank you. And I think that I needed that clarification because again, I could just see students automatically going to that point, or even me being like, oh, I don't know. But yeah, that helps a lot.
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about all conflict being equal. We're just saying that conflict is normal, and the more we address it in small measure, the less large measures we have to address. But we don't. We're conflict avoidant, and we just, you know.
Is conflict avoidant something that's natural to everybody on this earth? Are there certain countries that are more conflict welcoming? Is it like an American phenomenon that we're like very conflict averse?
I think that it does vary from place to place. Not as simplistically as conflict avoidant versus not conflict avoidant. I think that different people have different comforts and discomforts based on their cultural values and the sort of nature of relationship and the level of interdependence. In more interdependent cultures, there is a greater willingness to address conflict, whether it's indirectly or directly, because there's a recognition of the necessity of being interwoven in relationship. In the United States, I would say the reason that, or one of the main reasons that we're conflict avoidant is because we don't believe in interdependence. We believe in independence, and so we don't invest value or time toward conflict resolution because we just think that we can cut that piece of our life out and keep moving forward.
Mm.
And that's unique to, not exclusively unique to the United States, but it is unique to independent versus interdependent cultures. But
Thank you.
but it's not unaddressable, right? Because obviously it's an illusion to think that we're independent because we do rely on one another. And again, that's another opportunity for teaching and using the model of a learning community as a means for classroom and institutional cultures to recognize the interdependence, both with each other, with the earth, with all of these different crises that we're facing. I like having Amanda and all of her questions. This is really fun. You should just come to every class I teach. Okay, how are we doing on questions? Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Can I ask one more?
Please do.
I think someone's about to knock on my door. I think it's actually Amnesty International is about to knock on my door. But I'm going to ignore them for a sec. There's this piece of this that's a struggle for me is that, be there in a sec. Just 1 minute. So many of our conflicts are ongoing. Racism's a perfect example. It's hundreds of years of violence, unending conflict for Black people, unending conflict for Asian people, unending conflict for Latino and Hispanic people. And down the line, anyone who's visibly doesn't fit the white mold faces violence from the state and from private people, right?
Right.
So there are people whose position is, let's keep it going. And the reasons they want it, they might not understand them at all. They might be thinking they're not racist, but they do want to keep the system going. That's like most of my colleagues with racist education.
Right.
And then there are also truly bad actors who would prefer
Right.
the horror continue and even get worse, right?
Right.
And so it's this tough question of like bringing my curiosity. It's like when the Democratic Party brings their curiosity to negotiate about the border with Republicans, right? We're just going to keep our horrifying human rights abuses happening if we negotiate about lives. That's and I'm having so the orange analogy it falls so flat for me because it doesn't depict a conflict with any stakes.
Well, yes, it's an excellent example of showing the limited thinking versus the expansive thinking. But the examples that you share, which are obviously more intractable, is what the language that I would use to talk about those kinds of conflicts, and that they have higher stakes and they're more enduring, right? Still benefit from curiosity. They just are not going to be solved through one pass. And so,
well, and I guess it's that really tough question though. Like so many times, if you ask me why I want what I want, whether it's a good thing that I want, racial justice, it's hard to get to, or like a selfish thing, maybe, like just I want a new ukulele, but I might not be able to explain why, I might not be able to parse that out. And I think that it's a hard habit to build to get two people in real conflict to both be willing to be even curious about themselves,
yeah,
further about everyone else involved in the conflict. That's just such a huge challenge for me. Teaching, like I can give you 100 teaching examples of conflicts in the Portland Community College math departments. We have wars. We have the textbook wars is our thing we do.
Yeah.
One side wants open and freely accessible materials. The other side wants the best materials, regardless of the price.
Yeah.
You might be able to tell by sarcasm which side I'm on. But I can explain my values and my reasons for wanting open materials. People you ask why they want the best ones, they just say, because they're the best. They don't know the why. And it's hard. It's hard.
And no offense to your stance here, I'm sure that there are arguments on both sides of that issue. Even if I were to agree with you, if I brought my curiosity to it, I could probably tease out sufficient perspective that I might be able to reach some kind of compromise, or at least more of a compromise than the polarization. And that's so true in so many of our conflicts, is that we just get increasingly polarized without a lot of imagination or curiosity about why someone is occupying another stance, except for that they're a jerk or an idiot, you know? And trust me, I'm there. I rarely assign books for students to buy, because I think there's so many great open source resources and that students are struggling to pay for it. So like I'm 100% in that camp. But in my commitment to conflict, I recognize that there are complex reasonings that people often can't articulate, but that as a conflict practitioner, that's part of my job, is to help them understand and be able to articulate it so that we can have greater understanding of what's going on. And the other thing I was going to say about it is that the orange example is deceptively simple, because conflict is invariably more complex, and rarely do we resolve conflict just in the drop of a hat like that, you know? Like I said, you said too, we've been working on racial justice since forever, and we, make these very small steps forward and these large steps back, and yet we have to persevere. And so curiosity is not something that is easy to lend when you are feeling that you're not making progress, right?
I just want to add on to that, because Ralph, what you're saying, I have, again, just so many thoughts bubbling up. But when you have colleagues saying the best, one of the questions that comes to my mind is, what qualifies best to you? Like, how are you like unpacking that word best, and like what things in their life brought them to understand what best means?
Well, and there's a chat right here that I want to respond to because it's a classic example here. Kristen and Tana have chatted. Most open educational resources are not accessible to many students with disabilities. Very frustrating. That's true. But that statement also applies to most publisher material.
Right.
Why are open educational materials held to accessibility standards that publisher materials are not? Right? So there's like these questions that come up just like right here, even in a supportive environment where we're talking about peace building, that reveal schisms, that reveal
Absolutely.
differences. The differences are real, and people with passionate beliefs about accessibility are going to go for whatever they can find as the most accessible resource the most quickly.
See,
And
this is actually a beautiful example to show that even in a well-intentioned environment, there's inevitable normal conflict that happens when we're trying to frame the issue, because we frame it differently. So rather than attacking, and not that you were attacking, but attacking the way that one party has framed an issue, how do we bring curiosity to tease out more information? Which, in a sense, you have, Ralph, just done that. You said, well, why are we looking at it like this? Why don't we why don't we take it out of this binary that holds the polarization in place and really unpack what accessibility looks like? How do we prioritize accessibility?
And
Yeah.
even just off of that, if you're talking about the border, like the border is not just one thing, it is a bunch of things. So when you're talking about conflict and you like just ask the question why, and then you have so many different people coming with different responses to why, now you have like 10 different reasons and 10 different ways to approach the conflict. So although you may not be addressing the conflict, you can be addressing pieces of the conflict, because everybody's understanding the conflict differently.
So I'm going to say
that's
this.
the part, yeah, sorry.
No, I'm going to say this one more time. For the simplicity on this side of complexity, I wouldn't give you a fig. But for the simplicity on the other side of complexity, I would give you everything I own. That's exactly, it's a complicated process. It's not a one-stop shop. It's not like you solve racial justice with your good intentions. There's work. You get your hands dirty. You come back again and again. And if you can bring curiosity, you're going to go a lot quicker and a lot better and end up with a lot more of a fig. So I want to keep going for the sake of time, but thank you. These are great questions, and I, clearly I haven't created enough time for us to talk about them in great depth, but this was meant to be, an orientation to these concepts. So hopefully there'll still be stuff that you can take with you, and I'm available to talk with you more. And this speaks also to the concerns that Ralph mentioned, and that's the encouragement of empathy, whether it's for ourselves or others in conflict. Empathy is one of those words that's overused and understood. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. In nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg says, every action is an attempt at connection, but we often employ the wrong strategies or destructive strategies to achieve that. And so I'm suggesting that empathy is recognizing that, I had a mentor who said that she believed in the intrinsic value of all of humanity. And as someone who does the work that I do, I was surprised to find that I was surprised by that statement, right? Because I was like, well, yeah, except for the jerks, right? Or except for the people who voted for Trump, or who, whatever. We've always got some category of people who are exempt and people who insist on high cost textbooks. We've always got someone who is exempt from the generosity of heart that we're offering. So if we recognize that people's actions are an attempt to create connection or positive engagement, but they often have strategies that are unknowingly harmful, it invites us into curiosity to know what their attempt at connection is, and also an opportunity to engage, hopefully constructively, with the destructive strategies that are offered. So there's a lot of different kinds of empathy that are used. One is affective, understanding another person's emotions and responding appropriately. Somatic empathy is having some sort of physical reaction in response to what someone is experiencing, feeling what they're feeling. Cognitive empathy is understanding another person's process or how they're thinking about it. And one of the exercise that I want to offer about how to think about empathy here is oftentimes people talk about the golden rule, and I've had students upset when I try and unsettle the golden rule, because I know it has religious significance for some people. So forgive me if I am stepping on something sacred to you. But in conflict resolution, we talk about the platinum rule. So the golden rule is do unto others as others would have done do unto others as you would have done unto you. So this idea that if you are truly the best person you can be, you will treat other people how you want to be treated. And the platinum rule says, do unto others as others want done unto them, which is bringing curiosity to what that person needs and finding a way to meet those needs in the way that satisfies them, not your ideas of what they need to be satisfied for. And that, to me, is a wonderful example of what empathy looks like, because oftentimes we think we're offering empathy, but what we're doing is we're giving them what we might want in a given situation, instead of being truly curious and concerned and empathetic about what they need and figuring out how to meet their needs. So I just want to pose the question, and briefly, just for the sake of time, so I can get through the rest of the presentation, but how has this impacted your life? How does this play out in your learning community? What would it look like to go platinum? Who would benefit? So any thoughts or comments you have on those questions, I would love to hear. I'm currently fighting, well, not currently, but like over many years, my daughter and I have these huge arguments every year at her birthday, where she feels betrayed when we give her gifts that aren't the exact things that she wanted, right? And I try and explain gift giving as a process of finding something that that you feel like that person will like, and giving them a gift. It's not always the exact list of things that you have written down as wanting, which are usually 20 times more expensive than anyone is actually going to purchase, right? And so that's where we battle between the golden rule and the platinum rule, right? How do but my goal is to find something that she'll like, but not necessarily give her something that she's asked for. And so there's mundane ways in which we battle with this, and then there's larger ways that we battle with this, and certainly thinking about it in terms of like as an educator, I know oftentimes I have a goal for learning that exceeds the capacity of the students that I'm working with, right? And so how do I temper that? How do I ensure that I'm offering them value for their time and money, but not necessarily overwhelming them to the point that they can't receive anything that I'm offering. So this is something we negotiate, and I'm framing it as an example of empathy here, to be aware of what people need to be made whole or to be satisfied.
I'm thinking just about the questions that we ask our friends, our parents, our colleagues, whatever, in an everyday setting. And are they questions that I want the answer to, or are they the questions that they need to be asked because the other person wants to express something? So I don't know if any of you watch Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist, but there was just one episode that came up where she wasn't listening. And by listening, I mean like getting verbal, visual, nonverbal cues about how other people are, like what they're holding on to them and what they need to get off their chest. But unless somebody asks them the question, they're not going to. And so how are we hearing, listening, seeing what people need rather than, well, this is what I want to know about you today. Like, what did you think about this show? Or what did you eat for dinner? Rather than like, you have 2 kids. Like, how are you feel? Are you getting enough sleep? And so that's just where I'm thinking about on the like interpersonal level of empathy, and just how are we caring for our friends, our family, our colleagues, our students, and asking the questions, like more specific questions. And that means paying attention to people better.
Yeah, and paying attention to people better also to see what their intention is. And I know that intention is not the most important thing. There's impact that is also important to recognize, but even in alternative justice movements, there's a recognition that people who break the law or create harm are generally not doing it because they're a maniac. They're doing it because it felt like the only option for them to get through a given situation. And when we start to see that, okay, well, they have a need that they're trying to meet, and they just chose a really crappy way to meet that need, gives us an invitation into understanding someone that we could otherwise just discount by judging. And again, thinking about this in the COVID situation, people who took risks that, ended up with negative results or bad outcomes. Were those risks, was the fact that they took those risks problematic, or did they feel they needed to take those risks in order to get through the situation? So how we think about other people's actions and needs is a really important part of the empathy puzzle in bringing peace building into our classrooms, our learning communities. Okay, I'm going to keep moving, but we can come back to this if we need to, because I want to make sure we talk about mobilization of action, because I think this is super important. So change requires action. It requires work, and democracy only works when we do. We need to be involved in democracy in order for democracy to flourish. And peace demands participation. It's not something that we can just kind of get a pretty sticker and stick it on the top of a conflict and call it good. And so when we think about this, we think about all the different ways that we can engage in civic participation. We can engage in developing voice and agency for change within our smaller communities, like our learning communities, our classrooms, et cetera, and how that can play out in larger and larger spheres. And there's protocols and processes for mobilizing action. The one that I've shared with you here is a therapist's guide to finally conquering your fear of conflict. But it talks about how when we understand what needs to happen, we prepare for action, we practice that action, we apply it, and then we reflect on it, we develop understanding, and the cycle continues. And I think that oftentimes we're looking for easy solutions, we're pinched for time, we pinched for capacity. How do we mobilize that kind of action towards change, which is necessary in order for justice to flourish, and for change to transpire? So thinking about this again in terms of our own actions individually and as educators, what motivates us and or our students to actually step into that action, right? Again, we think about peace as a passive undertaking. We think about peace building as something that happens when, you know, when the stars are aligned or something, you know, and it's hard work, as is democracy, as is change processes. So how do we galvanize students and ourselves to get up off the couch and actually take action? What are we willing to make an effort to change? What's so important to us that we're willing to get involved and take action? What resources might we need to be able to step into those change processes? And how can we ensure that our efforts will make a difference? So these kinds of questions just invite us into thinking about how we can encourage ourselves and our others in our orbit to do the hard work of creating change. Great. Is that did you just put the universe of obligation? Is that what you were talking about? Great. So and I think that this is a really, you know, like, again, trying to boil down some concrete ideas for you. Curiosity is an important part, empathy is an important part, and actual action is an important part. It's not just something we can sit around and think peace into action. We can't think democracy into action, and we can't think change into action. It requires these incremental steps, and it requires a willingness on our part to make ourselves uncomfortable, to step into this sort of liminal space of uncertain conflict and put in our best effort of curiosity and empathy to try and build some kind of inclusive change process that is less about alienating or polarizing opposite perspectives and more about inviting deliberation and new ideas to be generated. So I'm going to just keep plodding through, and we can come back at the end and comment or question anything that you'd like.
You have about 2 minutes.
I know. So peace building to address and redress conflict. Specifically, I wanted to emphasize that to address conflict, building a culture of peace or creating a culture of peace is one where at least these three elements are present, where there is curiosity in response to conflict, where there is empathy to people who step outside of the bounds of normalcy or expectation, and there's a recognition of the action that needs to be mobilized for change to happen. And in terms of redressing conflict, then we can speak to collaboration and restoration, where we come up with protocols that are not shaming as their primary response or alienating as their primary response, but that seek to weave people back into the fabric of community. So again, these three elements of curiosity, empathy, and action speak to that effort to try and reweave the fabric of community. And I wanted to end on Jessica Murray's 5 steps. She is a Black peace builder. This is an article from Medium that she put out last year. She worked for the Common Ground Institute, and she says that there's 5 steps to take to address and redress peace building. The first is to acknowledge the pain. The second is to listen and lean in. The third is to confront your own bias or judgment. The fourth is to rethink what peace and justice means in the context that you're working in. And fifth is to use your power to champion your neighbor, thinking again to that collective interdependence that I spoke of earlier. I've given you some resources here, including Jessica Murray's article, which I highly recommend, some toolkits that can be used within your classroom and in your learning communities. I'm also happy to be a resource to you as you think through things. My email address is the best way to get in touch with me. And I'm sorry that I ran out of time, but your questions were so fantastic that it was great to spend time talking about them. And I hope that there's something you can take away from this conversation that will scaffold you into feeling more empowered as a peace builder in your communities.
Thank you so much, Amanda.